Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, commonly known as Che Guevara, El Che, or just Che, is arguably one of the most famous revolutionaries in world history, certainly in the history of the last century or more. In January 2000, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century, and the famous photograph that Alberto Corda took of Che, entitled Guerrillero Heroico, Heroic Guerrilla Fighter, has been called the most famous photograph in the world and a symbol of the 20th century. BBC News 2001. His name, his ideals, and his romantic image have become part of the spirit and symbolism of those who believe that the social injustices and worst forms of human exploitation in this world can be erased only by revolutionary means. Rarely in history has a single figure been so passionately and universally accepted as the personification of revolutionary idealism and practice. Moreover, even those who feel no sympathy for the ideals he upheld continue to be affected by the charisma of his historical persona and the enduring legacy of his revolutionary life. He personified the revolutionary ferment that swept the world during the momentous decades of tumultuous change that shook the world during the 1960s and 1970s. Thus, a prominent Mexican political writer, who was the foreign minister of Mexico from 2002 to 2003, has written the following about Che. Many of us today owe the few attractive and redeeming features of our existence to the 60s. And Che Guevara personifies that era better than anyone. Castigato 1997 to 410. More important, however, is since his death in 1967, Che's defiant and charismatic image in the 1960s. Photographs of him has become an almost universal symbol of revolution and resistance to social injustice around the globe. Anderson 1998. Che's iconic face appears on posters, banners, billboards, flags, books, periodicals, murals, websites, t-shirts, and walls in every region of the world. Indeed, his face, and to a lesser extent his name, are known to people of all ages everywhere. Che Guevara continues to be regarded by millions of people as a heroic figure because of his legendary revolutionary life and his self-sacrifice for his revolutionary beliefs. He was a man who not only lived by his principles, but died fighting for them. For decades after his death, he remains a figure of veneration among the oppressed, young rebels, radical intellectuals, social activists, revolutionaries, guerrilla fighters of all kinds, and the international global justice movement, often referred to by the mainstream media as the anti-globalization movement. He is also hated and vilified by many people in high places and in Cuban exile communities throughout the Americas, which remain vehemently opposed to the socialist government of Cuba and to the role played by Che in this government. First, as one of the most outstanding leaders of the revolutionary guerrilla war that brought this government to power, and subsequently as one of the most internationally famous leaders of Cuba's new socialist government, and champion of expanding Cuban-style socialist revolutions throughout the rest of Latin America and the world. Today, he is widely perceived in Latin America as the herald of a region-wide social revolution, Taibo 1997-10. Which many Latin Americans believe is as urgently needed today as it was in the 1960s when Che gave his life fighting for this cause. In fact, the idealistic origins of this cause can be traced back to the 1800s, when many of the inhabitants of the region rose up in rebellions and revolutions against foreign domination, colonialism, slavery, and ethnic discrimination, particularly the extreme forms of discrimination suffered by the Afro-Latino and indigenous peoples of the Americas. There is increasing interest throughout Latin America in his revolutionary example and ideals due to the continuing social injustices, extreme social inequality, chronic poverty, and political corruption in the region, as well as the rise of new leftist political movements and the election of popular leftist governments throughout Latin America. In response to this growing resurgence of interest in Che's revolutionary life and the 40th anniversary of his death, October 9, 2007, a two-part biographical feature film directed by the well-known Hollywood director, screenwriter, and cinematographer Steven Soderbergh was released in 2008 at the Cannes Film Festival in France. Moreover, to memorialize in 2007 the 40th anniversary of his death and in 2008 the 80th anniversary of his birth, many international conferences and public events were held around the world, especially in Latin America and Europe. The extensive body of recent literature, hundreds of books, and thousands of articles, video documentaries, Hollywood films, websites, songs, poems, and works of popular art on Che Guevara have ensured that his legend lives on and that he is known to people all over the world. Many of his own writings have been published, translated into many languages, and read by people of all ages. In fact, Che's revolutionary legend has grown as the years have passed since his death in 1967. And many of the revolutionary ideals that he lived and died for now appeal to a new generation of 21st century men and women around the world, particularly in Latin America. The continued political importance of his revolutionary example and ideals can be found nearly everywhere in contemporary Latin America, especially in socialist Cuba, but also in Central and South America. His revolutionary image and many of his ideals have been adopted by the Zapatista liberation movement in Mexico, the newly elected leftist leaders and governments in Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and the international global justice movement, which is composed of hundreds of environmental, women's, indigenous peoples, fair trade, radical labor, and peace and social justice organizations around the world. Indeed, the familiar revolutionary political slogan, Che Vive, Che Lives, which was shouted in the 1960s and early 1970s at anti-war protests and political demonstrations and painted as political graffiti on walls and buildings around the world, has as much political significance today in Latin America and the Caribbean as it did in the past. This book provides a comprehensive account of all aspects and paid rides of Che Guevara's life. It is for readers who know very little about him as well as those who know something about him and want to know more. It provides a chronological account of his life, starting with his early life in Argentina during the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s. His travels throughout Latin America during the early 1950s. The important role he played in the Cuban Revolution during the late 1950s and early 1960s. His unsuccessful revolutionary mission to Africa in 1965. His last revolutionary mission in Bolivia during 1966–1967, and the circumstances surrounding his death on October 9, 1967. It also discusses Che's contributions to the theory and tactics of revolutionary warfare and socialist theory and practice. Among other things, this book reveals that in addition to being a famous revolutionary and international political figure, over the course of his life Che was a road and materials analyst, medical research assistant, ship's nurse, traveling salesman, street photographer, doctor, author, head of the Central Bank of Cuba, military commander, director of Cuba's Central Planning Board, Minister of Industry, and an important foreign statesman. This book also reveals a great deal about his family life, his likes and dislikes, personality traits, and the most important people in his life. Moreover, it provides a great deal of information about the geography, history, politics, economics, and social problems of Latin America that were the context for his life and his contemporary legacy. This book does not focus exclusively on the life and the death of Che Guevara. It also includes an account of the fascinating story behind the publication of his Bolivian campaign diary, which was taken from him when he was captured and killed by elements of the Bolivian army. Moreover, this account of the posthumous publication of his diary is followed by the equally fascinating story of how his body, which was secretly buried after he was killed, was discovered in Bolivia and transferred to Cuba in 1997, 30 years after his death. The last chapters of this book examine how Che has been celebrated and held up as a revolutionary hero by the government leaders and PL socialist Cuba and by the new leftist political leaders, movements, and governments that have emerged in Latin America in recent years. Thus, the last two chapters of the book focus on Che's enduring political legacy and the important contemporary political influence of his revolutionary example and ideals throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Readers of this book are encouraged to approach the subjects discussed in the following pages with compassionate objectivity. Adopting this perspective is especially advisable for those readers who have had the good fortune to be raised in relatively affluent and secure living conditions, and who now are fortunate enough to find themselves living in comparatively stable and non-threatening political, economic, and social circumstances. Unlike these readers, the majority of humanity has been raised in poverty, and they are now living in relatively unstable, impoverished, and threatening political, economic, and social circumstances. Consequently, their views of the world around them and their aspirations and frustrations are quite different from the views and aspirations of the minority of humanity who live in affluence and relative security. For this reason, they are more willing to support revolutionary leaders and movements that promise to improve their living conditions and circumstances through the violent overthrow of the existing social order. Che's life provides an excellent case study of how individuals become revolutionaries, how the conditions and circumstances in which they live can lead them to follow this path. Che Guevara, the revolutionary, was molded by specific historical circumstances, societal conditions, and socio-psychological factors. The term revolutionary conjures up in the minds of many people a stereotype of a wild-eyed, bearded extremist who is driven by some fanatical urge to destroy the existing order of things, no matter what the cost in human life and property. Che Guevara does not fit this stereotype. In order to understand why Che became a revolutionary and why he died as one, it is necessary to put aside any preconceptions one has about revolutionaries and examine carefully his life and circumstances. Only by examining carefully the life of this remarkable man is it possible to gain insight into why he became a famous revolutionary and why he died a tragic death as a revolutionary guerrilla fighter in Bolivia at the age of 39. To understand why men and women like Che Guevara choose to live and die as revolutionaries, it is also necessary to recognize that the mainstream media's coverage of subjects such as revolutions, revolutionaries, socialism, communism, democracy, poverty, guerrilla fighters, terrorism, Latin America, imperialism, the role of the U.S. government in international affairs, and many of the other subjects discussed in this book often provides a quite biased and misleading perspective on these subjects. See NACLA. One of the main reasons their coverage is biased and misleading is because they tend to frame or explain these subjects using a culturally and politically ethnocentric perspective. That is to say, they present the world from a middle-class and above North American or European cultural and political perspective, and they rarely present alternative views of the world from other social class, cultural, or political perspectives. Moreover, they often do not provide adequate or accurate information on the political, economic, social, and cultural circumstances in which the majority of the people in Latin America and Africa, the Middle East, and Asia live. Apart from inaccurate reporting, they often misrepresent historical processes and report on political leaders, social movements, and political events using a narrative that reflects the fear of change and perceptions held by those who hold power and enjoy many privileges rather than the views and interests of those who have little power and few or no privileges. NACLA. Consequently, they do not do a good job of presenting the often radically different and opposing views people in this important region hold on subjects such as the ruling political and economic elites, social inequality and social justice, revolution and revolutionaries, socialism and capitalism, revolution and revolutionaries, socialism and capitalism, democracy and oligarchy, the military and police, poverty and human insecurity, and the role of the U.S. government and large transnational corporations in the affairs of their countries and the region. In order to understand the conditions, circumstances, people, and events that shape Che's life, it is important to have at least a basic understanding of Latin America's history, politics, economies, cultures, and social problems. In this regard, it is important to understand first of all that there is no single, uniform pattern of characteristics that fits all the countries of Latin America. Harris 2008. In fact, there are considerable differences between the 20 countries usually considered to make up this region. There are differences in terms of the size of these countries. The biggest by population and territory are Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, which are some of the largest countries in the world, while the smallest are countries such as Panama, Costa Rica, and Uruguay, which are some of the smallest in the world. They are all multicultural societies, but they differ in terms of the ethnic and cultural composition of their populations. Some Latin American countries, such as Bolivia, Mexico, and Ecuador, have large indigenous Indian populations, while others, such as Haiti, Cuba, and Brazil, have a large number of people of African descent. They also differ greatly in terms of their geography. For example, Bolivia and Paraguay are landlocked countries in the center of the South American continent, while Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic are located on tropical islands in the Caribbean. And some countries like Brazil and Mexico have lots of natural resources, while others, such as Uruguay and Haiti, have very few natural resources. They differ greatly in terms of their extent of industrialization. For example, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico are the most industrialized, while Bolivia, Haiti, and Nicaragua are some of the least industrialized in the Americas. And in terms of their main exports, for example, Venezuela's main exports are oil and bauxite, while Chile's main exports are copper and fruit, and Guatemala's main exports are coffee, sugar, and bananas. Moreover, they differ in terms of their relations with the United States. While the government of Mexico has more or less friendly relations with the government of the United States, but strained relations with the governments of Venezuela and Cuba. The Latin American countries also differ considerably in terms of how unequal the distribution of their total national income is among the population. Harris 2008 to 52. The income of the richest 20% of the population is 40 times the income of the poorest 20% of the population in Bolivia, whereas in Uruguay and Venezuela, the income of the richest 20% is approximately 11 times the income of the poorest 20%. For Latin America as a whole, the income of the richest 20% of the population is 19 times the income of the poorest 20%. By world standards, this 19-to-1 ratio of unequal distribution is quite high and is one of the reasons why Latin America is considered the region with the greatest social inequality and why Che Guevara believed a socialist revolution was needed in Latin America. In contrast, in the United States, the income of the richest 20% of the population is about 8 times the income of the poorest 20%, which is considered relatively high for an advanced industrial country. For example, the ratio in Canada is only 5.5 to 1. Despite their differences, however, the Latin American countries do share many characteristics and conditions. In fact, the differences that exist between the Latin American countries do not detract from the importance of their commonalities. With the exception of socialist Cuba, where most sectors of the economy were placed under state control in the early 1960s, all the Latin American countries have capitalist economies. And these economies all hold a subordinate status in the global economic order. Harris 2008. This subordinate status has to do with their historical development. They have all been shaped by the same international economic and political forces over the last 500 years. That is to say, they all have a history of European colonial conquest and domination, slavery, and other extreme forms of labor exploitation. Their economies were established under European colonial rule, primarily to produce and send agricultural products or mineral resources to the European markets of their colonial masters. In addition, their political systems were created to serve the interests of their colonial rulers, and then, after colonial rule came to an end, to serve the interests of their wealthy landowning elites, called oligarchies, rather than the general population. As a result, they have inherited government institutions, such as the military and police, that have strong authoritarian and repressive tendencies. This is one of the main reasons Che Guevara thought that an armed revolution was needed to bring about progressive change in Latin America. The economies of the region have all undergone a similar process of highly uneven, inequitable, and foreign-dominated economic development over the last 500 years. Harris 2008. And over the last 100 years. This form of distorted economic development, which has been variously labeled with terms such as underdevelopment or dependent development, has produced an unstable and slower rate of economic growth and more frequent and more severe economic crises than has been the case in the advanced industrial countries of the United States of America, Western Europe, and Japan. In this regard, many critical thinkers in Latin America and elsewhere, Che Guevara included, have argued that these countries were able to develop faster and create more advanced industrial economies because they have done so at the expense of the Latin American and African, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries, which have supplied them with cheap natural resources, cheap agricultural goods, and cheap labor as a result of the unfair prices and unfair trade relations imposed on them by the now advanced countries. Chilco 2003. since the end of World War II, and even before this in many countries of the region. The most important sectors of the Latin American economies have been dominated by transnational corporations and foreign investors with home bases in North America, Western Europe, or Japan. In addition, most of the Latin American countries are burdened by large foreign debt owed to large international private banks and the three powerful intergovernmental financial institutions that operate in the region: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. These three intergovernmental financial institutions are heavily influenced by the U.S. government, and together they tend to promote the interests of the large transnational corporations and foreign investors that are involved in the economies of the Latin American region. And, again, all the Latin American countries have been historically handicapped by unfavorable terms of trade that give unfair advantages to the more advanced industrial countries that dominate the global economic system. This situation was criticized by Che Guevara in his writings, speeches, and relations with government officials and leaders of countries around the world. After World War II, the increasingly powerful transnational corporations based in the United States and in some of the other advanced industrial countries invested heavily in Latin American economies to take advantage of their abundant supply of natural resources, cheap labor, lax environmental regulations, and captive consumer markets. Harris 2008. Over the last several decades, these powerful corporations and the international financial institutions mentioned above have promoted what they call the increasing integration of the Latin American economies into the global economic system, which is dominated by these very same corporations and financial institutions. Consequently, the most profitable sectors of the Latin American economies generally are dominated by these transnational corporations and foreign investors. These economies are also excessively dependent on the limited number of products they export to the advanced industrial countries, rather than producing products for their domestic markets. And as a result, most of the Latin American countries trade more with the United States and other advanced industrial economies than with each other. Along with these common economic traits, these countries have other, more distressing similarities. In most of these countries, a large percentage of the population lives in poverty. There is widespread unemployment, and a large sector of the population is forced into the so-called informal economy, in which they are precariously employed as street peddlers, small vendors, domestic workers, and day laborers, or engaged in illegal commercial activity, such as prostitution or drug trafficking. Harris and Neff 2008. The majority of the workers in the so-called formal sector of these economies are low-skilled and semi-skilled workers who receive much lower wages and many fewer benefits, if any, than comparable workers in the advanced industrial economies. Moreover, because a large percentage of the population is either unemployed, underemployed in temporary and part-time jobs, precariously employed in the informal sector, or engaged in subsistence or semi-subsistence agriculture. These economies are also characterized by the kind of unequal distribution of income mentioned above. That is to say, the majority of the population receives a small fraction of the total income of these societies, while the wealthy elites receive a major proportion of the total income and own most of the land. This unequal distribution of income and land is coupled with the increasing concentration of other forms of wealth, personal property, stock ownership, etc., in the hands of the relatively small elite, who form the top layer of the steep pyramidal class structures that exist throughout Latin America. Indeed, there is a growing polarization and income gap between the extremely wealthy upper classes at the top of these class structures and the middle and lower classes below them. As a result of this and equal distribution of income and wealth, there is extensive poverty, exclusion, and political inequality throughout Latin America. These distressing characteristics of Latin American countries have been criticized for a long time as immoral and unjust by progressive thinkers, social activists, and critical intellectuals, particularly from the middle and working classes. Che Guevara was a progressive thinker who became personally outraged by the social inequality, political oppression, social injustice, class discrimination, political corruption, and forms of foreign domination he saw in his travels around Latin America. Trained as medical doctor in his native Argentina to heal the sick and do no harm, Che's social consciousness and humanitarianism were challenged by his experiences on the road, where he encountered widespread poverty, social inequality, exploitation, discrimination, political repression, and the diseases and ill health caused by these unjust conditions. He was greatly influenced by these experiences, as well as the political events, leaders, and situations he witnessed firsthand in Latin America, and the practical political education he received as a result of his participation in many of these events and situations. In the following pages, Che's observations and insights, convictions, opinions, and actions will be examined in relation to the circumstances, events, ideas, prominent intellectuals, and political leaders he encountered over the course of his adult life in Latin America and around the world. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you liked the video, then please give it a like. We are going to talk about Che's life story in this series. If you want to know full series of Che's life, please subscribe our channel and press the bell icon as well so you will never miss any updates. Comment below to let us know your opinions. We will meet you again with another episode of this series. Till then, take care of yourself.